Oi, oi, all right, how's it going? I'm Grant, you're you. This is the Doodle Review, and if you've landed it, you're a ranker mate. Like me, you have a weird compulsion to rate and rank the catalogue of your favorite artists in order of greatness. And today we're putting the discography of one Elliott Smith through its paces. And just before we get into that, I do want to acknowledge how kind of weird it is to do this for Smith. You know, for a lot of fans, myself included, his solo work is basically untouchable. The sensitive, earnest nature of his songs and the untimely passing of the artist himself make the typical, vulgarity of ranking albums like sports teams. Here, it just seems even more pronounced. So just know if you're watching this and feeling that way, all of these records hold a special place. For me, Smith is one of my favorite artists of all time, to my mind. I'd be hard pressed to find another singer songwriter in this kind of folk acoustic oeuvre who has a better command of melody and chord structure, creating beautiful songs while somehow embodying a prickly, almost punk like attitude. He was absolutely unique. But artistic integrity aside, it's fun to stir the pot and rank shit. So we're going to go back through Smith's discography from most recent album to the earliest. That means we're starting with New Moon. And New Moon is one of two posthumous or posthumous releases in the mix. Smith sadly passed away in 2003, but being a prolific songwriter who seemingly enjoyed actually the process of recording, he would trial multiple arrangements of songs before settling on the version he would put on an album. Sometimes he would set songs aside and then come back to them years later. Because of all of that, there was just an absolute wealth of archive material available. New Moon collects a large amount of this material, 24 tracks, in fact. While they had, I think, been around, on bootlegs, tapes, and the hard drives of the truly devoted fans prior to 2007, this release made most of these songs cold from the self-titled Either or XO sessions available to a much wider audience. It's an absolute treasure chest of fantastic songs. You've got Angel in the Snow, Talking to Mary, Riot Coming, an earlier version of his track from Good Will Hunting, Miss Misery, and a deep cut that sticks out to me is New Disaster, which has this really interesting melodic progression on the guitar, strangely kind of dissonant, which juxtaposed with the mostly angelic voicings and arrangements of Smith just always pricks my ears up. Taken on a song by song basis, there's a real case for this compilation having some of Smith's best ever material within it. Taken as a full experience, though, compared to the rest of the discography, I find this one a bit dense. I think it's because these are all mostly all songs, recorded disconnected from each other, sometimes, found at their earliest stages in the album sessions. And because of that, they're predominantly centered around just Elliott and his guitar. And some would say that's the artist at his most pure. But I think one of the joys to me of listening to an Elliott Smith album are all of the production quirks and dynamics he laces through the track list. And that's something that he would broaden with every release, but it's right there at the beginning. And while New Moon has some tracks with different arrangements, particularly on the second half, like the chugging electric guitar and organ of Fear City, it's on the whole 24 tracks or an hour and a quarter of solitary Smith, which I think just makes it hard for all of the greatness of the songwriting to stick out. So I'm going to give this a C with a lot of love. There's not a bad song in the mix, but stacked with the rest of the discography and as a start to finish listening experience, I prefer almost every other album. So prior to that compilation release, 2004 was actually the first of the posthumous releases we would get, and arguably the last proper Elliott Smith album overall. Unlike New Moon, From a Basement on the Hill was an album that Smith was actually and actively working on before he passed. He wasn't quite finished with it, but from a batch of 30 songs, producer Rob Schnapp and Smith's ex-girlfriend Joanna Bohm sorted through and added finishing touches or cleaned up the tracks where he'd gotten to the point of completing his vocals. But regardless, this just feels like more of a cohesive album statement than lots of, just disparate sessions glued together. As such, while on the whole, track for track, New Moon might have a higher hit rate, this album is to me a much more enjoyable listening experience. from start to finish, just due to there being natural kind of peaks and troughs and dynamics in the tones, the instruments, and the voicings. On the other hand, this is still a posthumous release, and naturally it suffers in a way that most of these sorts of albums do. I think, you know, the custodians of the estate probably aren't quite as stringent as the artists themselves would be when it comes to picking what makes the record. And some songs here do still feel like they're like 90% completed arrangement wise. Some of the songs I think sound like, I guess, almost like sculptures, just lacking that very final sculpt, like that final rendering. But sadly, obviously, Smith wasn't around to do it, and this is the best we'll get. And that in itself, I think, adds its own level of character. Basement also features a lot of experimental production and composition, which doesn't always feel fully formed, but this somewhat adds to the record's charm. Coast to Coast, Pretty Ugly Before, Memory Lane, King's Crossing, they're all songs that really resonate with me, despite, you know, all of the weird reversed guitar parts, the distortion, the samples, and pump organs. And of course, this album also features Fond Farewell, which is to my mind one of the best Elliott Smith songs of all. I'm going to put this one in the B tier, which might seem low, but just for context, I recently put together my top 10 of albums released in 2004. And this one was very comfortably at the top of that list, or the start of that list. It was number 10. But, you know, in a year where there were so many banger albums, I really think that proves, you know, how highly I think of it. But again, I just think this catalogue has even higher heights to scale, which aptly brings us on to Figure Eight. This is the album that gave us the iconic artwork of Smith standing in front of the swirling lines painted on the wall behind him. And I believe that wall in Los Angeles remains painted with this design as a memorial to him to this day, which is kind of cool. Figure Eight, to me, represents Elliott Smith at a point in his career where his production, instrumentation, and arrangement skills equally matched the heights of his innate melodic and songwriting capabilities. You know, as we'll see as we kind of go back through each album from Roman Candle onward, there's new layers of production and instrumentation added each time. And I feel like Smith's ability to dress songs in greater instrumentation without compromising the intensity or emotion seemed to grow each time. And Figure Eight is the peak of that. I'd actually argue that where Basement falters is perhaps because Smith actually started slightly to put the cart before the horse in terms of production over songwriting on that album. But that just might be, you know, due to his frame of mind during the recording of that. My favorites on this one are the haunting and despairing Everything Means Nothing to Me, and the spidery kind of off-kilter riffs of LA and Junk Bond Trader. It's in these tracks where the full band instrumentation really complements Smith's composition. Something about the punch of the drums just really propels those kind of weirdly timed chord changes, and it sounds brilliant. This to me is one of his classics, and it's the best I think of his full band format, and I'm putting it in the S tier. Next, we're talking about the fourth Elliott record, released in 1998 and his first for major label DreamWorks, XO. And this was the first album after Smith kind of broke through, not just because Either Or had come out the year before and been positively reviewed, but also because it happened after his contribution to Good Will Hunting, where he even eventually performed live at the Oscars. Now, admittedly, XO would have been way into recording at that point, but it just sounds like a lot more money was put into the production of this record. You hear it almost immediately as the full band kick in on Sweet Adeline, not least because it is a full band. You know, you've got piano, lead guitar, bass, drums, but just because it all sounds so lush and practically sparkling on the recording. And the best example of that kind of sparkle to me would be the opening of the track Bled White, with those double-tracked acoustic guitars sliding up and down the neck. It just sounds so crisp. I really got into Elliott Smith in my last year of school, and at the time I had this really basic MP3 player. You could put maybe 2-3 albums on it if you were lucky, and the 2-week Easter break of that year was banging weather-wise. And I remember every day getting on my bike to ride to either my mates or my girlfriends, and this album was what I was listening to. In hindsight, I don't think I could have picked a better like springtime album, but now like 15 years on, which is slightly terrifying. As soon as I hear the opening notes of Adeline, or better yet, Tomorrow Tomorrow, which I think could be my all-time favorite Elliott Smith tune, whenever I hear those songs, it just immediately takes me back to that little stretch of time. It's kind of crazy how strongly it does that. Despite the positive memories and nostalgia, there are some minor misses for me on this record. Baby Britain, I just find a bit twee for my liking, and after a couple of years of channeling my teenage angst through the last few tracks, particularly I didn't understand, I actually now struggle to take that song seriously. I also had Amity as my alarm clock tone for like 6 months, which was stupid. Of course, is absolutely still brilliant. You know, Bled White, Pitseller, the Waltz tracks, and Tomorrow Tomorrow, as I've said, stunning. But to me, this is a run at a sound that he'd perfect on the aforementioned Figure 8. I'm going to put this one in A. Now it's time to take a look at Smith's breakout record, and one many people will go back to and cite as the definitive Elliott Smith record. It's 1997's Either Or. This one continues with the lo-fi home recording vibe that created the intensely intimate feeling we'd heard on his first two albums, but subtly it layers on this, again, sparkling instrumentation. We start with the very minimal, almost bedroom production of Speed Trials, but then Alameda hits us with a crisp acoustic drum kit hit with more clarity than we'd heard thus far in his career, and it's then followed by the glorious stereo panned acoustic guitars of Ballad of Big Nothing. This, I think, is Either Or's secret weapon, marvelously balancing the lean-in quietness that had captivated Smith's initial followers, while blossoming into moments of lush color that could alert wider audiences to his greatness. What's important is that throughout this record, the little imperfections remain. There's fret buzz, even a couple of moments where you hear Smith just slightly having to adjust his left hand to fully realize a chord after a quick change, and occasional breaks to his angelic falsetto. And I think that fragility is the magic. It's what sells Smith's earnestness, his tenderness on tracks like Say Yes Between the Bars, but also his bitterness on Ballad of Big Nothing and Rose Parade. This is a classic. I don't think you can argue with it. It's the bridge record from the quiet lo-fi recordings of Roman Candle and Self-Titled to the widescreen full band productions of EXO and Figure 8. And I think it's essential listening and very easily going in the S tier. That brings us to the 1995 Self-Titled record. And this was the album I heard first. Longtime followers of this channel and anyone that happens to know me that's watching this might roll their eyes slightly, but the reason I heard this was, Queens of the Stone Age. They covered Christian Brothers. I love that band, and their version of that song was just mesmerizing to me. I'd heard the name Elliott Smith before, but when they released the cover in 2007, that was just like the catalyst for me to go and check out his stuff. And I soon realized that it was Smith's songwriting that I was drawn to, not Josh Homme's interpretation, although it is fantastic. I originally thought they added the twiddly verse guitar part, but was pleasantly surprised to find it was indeed right there in the original. I think to this day, that song is probably still my favorite, though it does have strong competition. But for me, it encapsulates everything I love about the artist in one song: wit, heart, and a spit in your eye punk spirit buried just under its melancholy. I feel like this self-titled album is probably the purest expression of all of those trademarks before he went on to add layers and layers of production to end up with that wall of sound aesthetic, which is equally as good in its own way. But this one is going in the S tier for me. And here we are, right at the start, with 1994's Roman Candle, Smith's first solo album, recorded without intention to release at first, and it was just at the tail end of his days with Heat Miser. Now, I won't go into too much detail on this one because I put out a whole deep dive on this album just a few months ago, which is linked in the description. But on this album, within a rough, crackly cocoon of sound, Elliott Smith, the folk singer, songwriter, iconic Elliott Smith, is fully formed in there. The track list is scattered with these little nuances, quirks, or outright stylistic decisions that would become well-known trademarks throughout the rest of the artist's impressive but short career. Condor Ave has Smith's classic half-strummed, half-fingerpick style with these walking low notes that trace out the vocal melody. This track also introduces his ability to use expletives in a way that was always like strangely powerful and memorable. You know, in this case, the line, what a shitty thing to say, did you really mean it? And a few tracks later on No Name, we get a perfect example of the guitarist's ability to weave these little earworm melodies inside of an already emotive chord progression. Roman Candle is certainly an exceptional debut, but I don't think it represents anywhere near the peak, which would come on the subsequent albums we've covered. Certain songs like Drive All Over Town, while perfectly matching the vibe of everything else here, just isn't quite as memorable. And not quite to the same standard as the cousins on the rest of the track list. And there's also like a trace of self-deprecation in the representation that I think undercuts the amazing work here. You know, calling 4 out of the 9 tracks No Name, for instance, seems like willfully trying to put up a barrier to keep audiences outside, while the anxious and quiet, you know, subdued nature of Smith's work is, of course, at the heart of what makes him such a magnetic performer. I feel like on subsequent albums, he managed to find a way to kind of maintain this spirit while confidently presenting the music. So to my mind, I think I'm gonna place this one in B. Right, that's the whole Elliott Smith discography ranked. Time to knock it on the head. What do you make of this though? This is just what I think. Let me know in the comments. Would you put it any differently to me? Would you mix it up? Do you absolutely hate this? Do you hate the idea of even ranking Elliott Smith? Which I feel you. I don't know. Let me know. You know, leave some comments. Check out some other videos in the description that you might like the full Roman Candle review or my top 10 albums of 2004 that Basement is on. And if you can be asked to do all that, you may as well subscribe. Stick around, share some thoughts, show some love, or just have some abuse in the comments. And I'll see you in the next video. Cheers, mate. Take care. Now you go. Bye.